I feared Thetford's fiery temper could lead to a fatal outcome. He might shoot you, or have you thrown in jail. I deeply regretted my foolish prank, and hurried home to try and prevent any harm that could arise from it. At the very least, confessing my own involvement would redirect Thetford's anger towards me, the one who deserved it. As I arrived home, there was no sign of alarm or commotion from the married couple's quarters. This was perplexing. I waited anxiously for the morning to bring some clarity, and indeed it did. An unexpected event had taken place in their bedroom. They found a baby sleeping peacefully in their bed. Thetford had been awoken twice during the night, once by a noise in the closet, and again by a sound at the door. Naturally, there was suspicion of a connection between the mysterious noises and the foundling. Upon further investigation, a pair of rough shoes was found in the closet, and the chamber door, which Thetford had locked earlier, was discovered to be open, as was a kitchen window. To others, these occurrences were a source of bewilderment and skepticism, but to me, they were perfectly comprehensible. I felt immense relief that my plan did not result in any dire consequences, and I was astounded by your resourcefulness and persistence in extricating yourself from such a precarious situation, Wallace concluded. This tale merely confirmed my own suspicions, but its details were quickly overshadowed by the grim picture of the hospital's state that was painted for me. I was utterly flabbergasted and appalled by the sheer scale of the problem. It was clear that the individuals who could be bought with money were immoral and unscrupulous. Though they could be useful tools with proper supervision and guidance, such oversight could not be purchased. What sort of qualities was necessary for the governor of such an institution? They must possess zeal, diligence, and perseverance, and act with pure and lofty intentions. They must be both gentle and firm, brave and adaptable. Finding someone who perfectly embodied all of these attributes was desirable, but impossible. However, a dispassionate and honest commitment to duty and humanity could be incredibly valuable. Did I not possess such a passion? Could my limited abilities not alleviate some of this evil? No one had yet claimed this loathsome and dangerous position. Though my abilities and insight were meager, if they were honestly employed, they could still have a positive impact. I was compelled to immediately travel to City Hall and express my desires, but I was held back by my own illness and Wallace's condition. It was my greatest obligation to reunite this young man with his loved ones. Once that was accomplished, I could return to the city and fulfill more extensive duties. Wallace had rested for a few hours and was willing to set out on the journey. However, it was now noon, and the sun was blazing down with unbearable intensity. Wallace was more aware than I of the harmful effects of these rays. We had barely left the city when my companion's strength gave out entirely. If I hadn't supported him, he would have collapsed on the pavement. Though I was hardly in better shape, my determination was much stronger. I brushed off his illness and tried to convince him that his energy would return the farther we got from the urban center. Once we found some shade, a brief rest would bring us back to health and happiness. But nothing could restore his spirit or get him moving. Going forward or turning back was equally impossible. If he managed to make it back, where would he find refuge? The risk of relapse was high. His room at Thetford's was unoccupied. If he could make it back there, maybe I could find him a doctor and take care of him myself. His situation was dire and depressing. Staying in the street, exposed to the scorching sun, was out of the question. I couldn't carry him. It was too much for me. Should I ask the first passerby for help? Just then, a horse and carriage zoomed past us. The occupant could provide the aid we needed. Maybe he would divert from his course and take poor Wallace to the house we had just left. This thought propelled me forward, even though I was weak. I ran as fast as I could to catch up with the carriage. It took all my effort, but I finally succeeded. Luckily, there was only one person in the vehicle who stopped when I asked. He had a gentle and reassuring demeanor. "Good sir," I implored. "This young man is too sick to walk. I need him taken to his lodgings. Would you be willing to give a ride to a man in need for money or charity?" I asked the hesitant traveler. "He's not sick, just feeble, and I only ask for 20 minutes of your time. You may name your reward." The man was wary, explaining that he had not ventured into the city and was only passing by its outskirts. He wished to help those less fortunate but could not risk his own life when he had a family to provide for. I respected his decision and prepared to leave. But then a thought occurred to me. Since this traveler was headed into the countryside, perhaps he would be willing to take my friend with him. I believed the fresh air would benefit his weakened state more than the city. I asked where he was headed, and was pleased to learn that his home lay beyond Mr. Hadwin's, and that he would be passing by his door. With gratitude, I thanked the traveler and led my friend to his chaise. We set off towards the countryside, hopeful for a speedy recovery. He was more than willing to give Wallace a ride in his carriage and drop him off at his uncle's place. This unexpected and welcome turn of events exceeded my wildest dreams. I rushed to tell Wallace the good news, and he eagerly agreed to hop into the carriage. I didn't even think about myself at that moment, or whether I could use the same means to escape my own danger. The stranger didn't seem to worry about me, and Wallace's sadness and weakness can explain why he didn't ask me to join them or express concern about my safety. As soon as Wallace was settled in, the traveler sped away. I stood there, still and silent, watching them until the carriage turned a corner and disappeared from my view. Now, I had time to reflect on my own situation and think about the sudden and varied events that had occurred in the city over the past few hours. My mission was accomplished quickly and successfully. My emotions had swung back and forth, but now I felt calm and confident about this young man's future. Before the sun went down, he would be back in his family home, bringing immense joy to that peaceful and pure abode. Even though this thought was comforting and uplifting, I soon started thinking about what my duty required, and the fact that Wallace's safe departure gave me the freedom to pursue it. I was still determined to offer my services as a hospital supervisor. My physical weakness might lead to sickness, but I couldn't predict that outcome. The high elevation and fresh air of Bush Hill might help me overcome my fatigue and regain my health. At the very least, I had to use my strength wisely while I still had it. I made up my mind to head straight to the City Hall and began crossing the fields between Sassafras and Chestnut Street. My attention had been diverted from the money in my possession and the image of the desolate woman to whom it belonged by more pressing concerns. Though my intentions towards her remained unaltered, I began to worry that my death might prevent us from meeting. It seemed prudent to dispose of the money in a useful way rather than leaving it to chance. The city was beset by hunger and neglect, exacerbating the spread of disease. Could the money not be put to better use in alleviating these ills? While I lived, I had no control over it, but in death, I could dictate its course. But how? How could I ensure that my intentions were carried out without relinquishing ownership during my lifetime? These thoughts were interrupted by a sudden surge of sensations. The weight on my brow and stomach intensified, my brain grew numb, and my limbs gave way. Fever had taken hold. I had hoped that my illness would pass on its own, but now the grave loomed before me, and my plans for curiosity and benevolence threatened to be forgotten. Though my powers of reflection remained intact, I knew that lying alone and unprotected in the street would lead to a terrible fate. The first passerby would summon a carriage to take me to the hospital, a fate I could not bear to contemplate. My current desire was to find a place to hide, where I could go unnoticed and live out my days in peace. The homes of Thetford or Medlicott might provide such an escape if only I could reach them. I pushed myself to the limit, but only managed to move a mere 100 paces. I then stumbled upon the steps leading up to Welbeck's house, a surprise that led me down a new path of thought. My condition was too weak to continue, and I knew this dwelling all too well. Its entrances were all sealed shut, and I couldn't be sure if it had been abandoned since my last escape. It seemed unoccupied at present, but I couldn't be certain. Perhaps there were beds or sofas inside where I could find some rest without fear of being discovered. However, it was clear that every entrance was firmly locked. That was until I thought of the bathhouse, which didn't require such high levels of security. I was burning up with fever and desperately needed to cool down. The thought of bathing and drinking from the well was too tempting to ignore, especially since I wanted to avoid the attention of any passers-by. I used every ounce of energy left in me to climb the wall, hoping to find refuge inside. Once I reached the well, I drank deeply from its cool waters. The relief was almost instantaneous, and I felt my fever subside. My mind and body felt lighter, and I knew I was in a much better state than before. As I gazed upon the building, I couldn't help but feel that it was already perfect. However, my gaze fell upon a lower window that was slightly ajar. I couldn't tell if it was left open on purpose or if it was a result of carelessness, but it didn't matter. It was open, and it provided a way in. I didn't hesitate to take advantage of the opportunity. I had no ill intentions. I simply wanted to escape the constant harassment of the city's rulers. All I wanted was to be left alone to die in peace. As I made my way through the rooms, I couldn't help but notice that nothing had changed since my last visit. The furniture was still in the same place, and the room that had once belonged to Welbeck was empty. The cabinets and closets were broken and empty as well. I couldn't help but wonder if it was the work of thieves, or the result of the creditors coming to collect their debts. Either way, it didn't matter. This room would serve as my sanctuary. I hoped that my illness wasn't serious, and that it would pass quickly. I lay down on the bed, using the carpet as a makeshift blanket. My mind was racing with thoughts and worries, but I tried to focus on the present and the remedies that were available to me. I had water and medicine within reach, and I wasn't afraid to use them. I just needed to wait and see what would happen. My thoughts were jumbled and chaotic, but I tried to find comfort in the fact that I was finally alone. As I pondered the fate of the bank bills, my mind was consumed with the plight of the suffering masses. The thought of using this wealth to aid the destitute during this time of great affliction seemed the most noble of causes. However, I knew that if my death went unnoticed, the house would remain undisturbed until the scourge had passed, rendering my efforts useless. And yet, with winter fast approaching, the need for aid would only grow more dire. The solution seemed obvious: to entrust the bills to a trusted public figure who would ensure their proper use. The current chief magistrate fit the bill perfectly, but to send the package, I needed paper and writing implements. Would they be found in the upper room? I had to know. I left the bed behind and made my way to the study. The darkness was all-consuming, with only a faint light illuminating the entries and staircases. Each room I passed was locked, but the key was conveniently left in each lock. I had hoped that the study's entrance would remain undisturbed, but upon reaching it, I found the door shut tight with no key in sight. Despite my initial disappointment, I believed it was still possible to gain entry, as the door may have been unlocked by chance or intention. As I reached for the lock, a sound echoed from within, as if a bolt had been drawn to bar the door. I was taken aback, for it signaled that someone else was already present and wished to keep visitors out. The memory of the unbarred shutter downstairs immediately came to mind, and the coincidence of two people entering the same house and seeking the same room was a mystery in itself. Yet, I began to question whether I had truly heard anything at all. An empty dwelling can play tricks on one's senses, and every sound seems unfamiliar. With renewed courage, I tried the lock again and again, but the door remained stubbornly closed. My curiosity and fear were both aroused by the signs of violence I had seen downstairs, hinting at the presence of looters. The occupant of this room was clearly seeking privacy and concealment, but I was in no shape to confront a violent intruder. Seeking entry was futile, and forcing my way in would be foolish. I was torn between leaving and staying, unsure of what to do next. Despite my unsuccessful attempts at unlocking the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that gaining access to this room was crucial. Despite my pessimism about gaining any useful information, I couldn't resist the urge to peek through the keyhole. What I saw was not the usual twilight one might expect at this hour, but rather a faint lamp-like glow. This discovery only served to heighten my suspicions. Lamplight in an empty mansion, especially in a room that had been the site of disastrous events, was certainly ominous. Until that moment, I had seen no direct evidence of anyone's presence. I hadn't even considered how I might confirm or deny the presence of a person in the room. But my curiosity got the better of me, and I called out, "Is there anyone in there? Speak up." Almost immediately, someone inside exclaimed, "Good God!" The brief silence that followed left me waiting expectantly for a response. Was the person surprised? In pain? Grieving? It was hard to say. My earlier suspicions returned, suggesting that the person inside might be incapacitated by illness, just as I was. Perhaps this individual was a servant, left to care for the house, who had contracted the same malady as me. Or maybe a thief had come to rob the place and was now too sick to leave. In either case, whoever it was inside would be avoiding detection and intrusion at all costs. These thoughts did not weaken my determination or divert my efforts to gain access to the room. The individual inside was a fellow sufferer, and it was my duty to help and support them to the best of my ability. I spoke once again, pleading, "Whoever you are, I implore you to answer. I mean you no harm, only goodwill. Open the door and let me know your condition. I am here to assist you." In response, a deep groan and a sob, suppressed by a great effort, reached my ears. This expression of distress touched my heart. Fear vanished entirely, replaced by overwhelming compassion. I continued to request entry, promising any aid or comfort that my circumstances allowed. The answers came in tones of anger, impatience, and grief, saying, "I need no help. Do not vex me with your pleas and offers. Flee from this place. Do not linger for a moment, lest you share my fate and meet your own death." I regarded these words as the delirium-induced ravings of despair. The speaker's manner and speech indicated that he was not a servant but of a higher class, intensifying my desire to see and be of help. My remonstrances were firmly and persistently rejected. For a while, incoherent and passionate exclamations poured out. Eventually, I was only allowed to hear heavy sighs and sobs, which spoke volumes of grief more eloquently than any words could. This behavior filled me with both wonder and pity. I could not comprehend why this person had come here, or what motives drove him to deny my pleas for entry. Despite the apparent hopelessness, I repeated my request to be admitted. My persistence seemed to have exhausted his patience, and he exclaimed with a thunderous voice, "Martin Slaught, leave me alone. Stay but a moment longer, and my fury, like a ferocious tiger, will pounce on you and tear you apart." The words sent shivers down my spine. The voice that spoke was unfamiliar, yet it knew my name. Despite the unlikelihood of my presence in this house, I was recognized without hesitation. My curiosity and empathy remained, but I had no choice but to abandon my mission. I left the door reluctantly and returned to my bed, where sleep was desperately needed. However, the chaos and fear surrounding me made it impossible to rest. I tried to recall the voices of those I had spoken to earlier, hoping to find a similarity to the threatening voice. Eventually, I remembered a man named Colville, who arrived in my father's district 3 years ago. He was an intelligent and talented schoolmaster, with a gentle and disciplined demeanor. He preferred solitude and was highly respected by his students and neighbors. His character had initially appeared to be beyond reproach, and everyone considered his conduct faultless. However, after a year had passed, the situation took a dramatic turn. A young and innocent daughter of one of his patrons was believed to have fallen victim to the cunning charms of a despicable seducer. Gradually, the identity of the betrayer was uncovered, revealing that he had employed the same deceitful tactics to prey upon numerous others successfully. This arch-villain was none other than Colville. Sensing the impending storm of retribution, he disappeared and has not been heard from since. My encounters with him were infrequent and brief, as I was just a young boy at the time. Thus, I failed to recall his voice, or recognize that the voice emanating from the room above was that of Colville. While I had scant reasons to identify his features or speech, I had ample cause to despise him and relentlessly seek revenge. The first victim of his actions, the one whose ruin was discovered, was none other than my sister. This unfortunate girl sought solace from the reproach of our parents, the scorn of society, the torment of remorse, and the anguish caused by Colville's treachery and abandonment through self-inflicted death. She was innocent and beautiful. Before the tragedy, our souls were intimately connected through countless similarities, shared sympathies, lifelong companionship, and the bond of siblings. She was my sister, my guide, and my friend. But she met a violent, premature, and tragic end, tainted by her own desperation. I cannot think of her without being overwhelmed by grief, while thoughts of her destroyer fill me with an unjustifiable but unshakable hatred that I cannot suppress. When the image of Colville rushed into my mind on this occasion, I was nearly jolted out of my seat, startled by the intensity of my emotions. Meeting him again, after such a long time apart and in such unexpected and sudden circumstances, brought back a rush of unpleasant memories and emotions that seemed to completely overtake me. His recognition of me, his obvious discomfort at being seen by me, and his initial shock upon hearing my voice only served to reinforce my feelings. I wasn't sure how to proceed. My physical weakness made it difficult to act on my vengeful thoughts, but even if I could, I knew that it wouldn't be right to lash out at him. All I wanted was to forget about him entirely and avoid any further encounters. His refusal to open the door when I knocked was actually a relief. I would have preferred to be thrown into a deep pit than to have to face Colville again. It's shameful to admit, but my anger toward him was only fueled by the pain and suffering he had caused me. It's not right to hate someone simply because they have done us wrong. We must feel compassion for even the most wicked among us, and work towards preventing and repairing the damage they cause. I still have so much to learn, but I doubt I'll live long enough to do so. My emotions towards Colville may be misguided, but they are overwhelming. I jumped out of bed and prepared to flee into the streets. I had no regard for what might happen to me, as no fate could be worse than living under the same roof as a criminal. As soon as I stepped onto the floor, I was interrupted by a sound from above. The study door opened slowly and carefully. There was only one explanation for this. Colville was sneaking out and would probably leave the house quickly. My belief that he was sick was disproven. An illegal plan was in line with his character and matched the previous observations. I couldn't stop him from leaving, and I didn't want to. I was thrilled at the thought, and quickly threw myself back onto the bed, covering my face with the carpet. He would probably pass by the door without noticing me, and my covered face would spare me from the agony of seeing him. I could hear the footsteps upstairs, and they were light and cautious. They reached the stairs and descended. The room I was in was dark, like the others, but a light, similar to the pale reflection I saw in the study, began to shine through. Even though my face was covered, my eyes were free to observe the signs of Colville's approach moving on the wall. My anxiousness increased as he got closer. He stopped at the door, and the light paused for a moment. Then he entered the room. My emotions were out of control, and I believed he was approaching the bed and staring at me. At the same time, without thinking, I threw off the covering and turned to face him, locking my eyes on him. My suspicions were correct. As I gazed upon the figure, holding a candle in his right hand and staring intently at the bed, I felt a sense of dread wash over me. His demeanor was that of someone consumed by fear and doubt, and his features were twisted in agony. At that moment, I took in every detail of this haunting vision. My heart sank as though pierced by a dagger, and I let out a shriek that surely must have echoed through the streets. It seemed that fate had conspired to test my resolve and bravery once again. This time my mind conjured up a spectre that left me trembling with fear. I felt as though the dead had risen from their graves to haunt me in my bed. The figure before me was not Colville, as I had initially feared, but rather the shape and visage of Welbeck himself. His preternatural posture and countenance left no doubt in my mind that this was a vision beyond the realm of the living. Chapter 17. The man whom I had accompanied to the middle of the river, the one I thought I had seen drown, was now standing right in front of me. Although I couldn't completely dismiss the idea of supernatural occurrences, I was able to push the thought aside as soon as the apparition appeared. Welbeck had managed to survive the river, or had somehow been brought back to life. The former seemed like the most logical explanation. It immediately made me suspicious that his jumping into the water was a trick meant to convince people of his death. His own story had shown him to be skilled in deception and willing to do whatever it takes to achieve his goals. But wasn't he in cahoots with Colville? What could possibly unite such wicked individuals other than an agreement to commit evil deeds? As I pondered these thoughts, Welbeck's face and actions betrayed emotions too intense to put into words. The looks he gave me were frenzied and unsteady. He paced the floor, stopping every so often to stare at me with intense urgency. He stood there in a conflict of passions, unwilling to speak. Finally, he approached the bed where I sat and spoke to me. "What is this? Why are you here? Are you trying to haunt me like the ghost of my past mistakes, despite the threat of disease? What do I have to do with your confident and guiltless demeanor, your foolishly trusting yet unyielding spirit? Is there no way to escape your pursuit? Must I once again spill blood and dig a grave for you beside Watson?" I listened to his words with calmness, feeling both pity and suspicion toward the man. He seemed more mad than cruel, and I looked at him with a compassionate and wistful gaze. I spoke to him in a gentle and composed tone. "Mr. Welbeck, you are both unfortunate and criminal. I wish I could help you find happiness and virtue, but I have no power to change your habits or rescue you from misery. I believed you were dead, and I am relieved to find that I was mistaken. While you are still alive, there is hope that you can turn away from your mistakes and find peace. You have nothing to fear from me. If my silence on your past will help you, then I will keep it. I take my promises seriously, and once given, they cannot be broken. Our meeting was accidental since I believed you to be dead. You are mistaken if you think my life will cause you any harm, but you are free to believe that my death will benefit you. It is coming soon, and I have no objections to your thinking it is fortunate for you. The inevitability of death is a universal truth, and its timing and manner are of little consequence. While so many around me succumb, it would be foolish to expect to stand unscathed. My time on this earth has been humble and brief, but I do not protest the decree that has made it so. The pestilence has now taken hold of me, and the likelihood of recovery is slim. I have come here to die in peace without disturbance. All I ask of you is to prioritize your own safety by fleeing immediately, and to not reveal my condition to the hospital's agents, thus thwarting my hopes of remaining concealed, I said. Welbeck listened intently, his wild demeanor replaced by a look of confusion and fear. "You are ill," he said, his voice trembling with a mix of terror and affection. "You know this and do not expect to recover. No mother, sister, or friend will be here to offer you sustenance, medicine, or comfort, yet you remain calm and considerate of others, even of me, who has committed such heinous acts and deserves nothing from you. What a wretched coward I am! Despite my current and anticipated misery, I cling to life. To follow your heroic advice and flee, leaving you alone and vulnerable, is the strongest inclination. I would resist it if I could, but I cannot. To abandon you would be a despicable and cowardly act beyond anything I have done before, yet to stay and care for you would mean contracting the disease and perishing alongside you. Life, despite its burden of guilt and shame, is still precious. Yet you urge me to leave and forego my assistance. Indeed, I would be of no use and only harm myself while providing you with no benefit. I cannot venture into the city to find a doctor or caregiver. I must remain hidden from the public eye forevermore. I must leave you then, he said, hurrying towards the door. He paused, hesitating, before turning back to face me. I begged him to go, telling him that his presence would only put him in danger without any benefit to me. "Where could I go?" he asked. "The world offers no sanctuary for me. I came here seeking something to save me from ruin and death, but it's gone. Someone has taken it, and now my fate is sealed. My last hope is gone. Slaught, I will stay with you," he continued, his voice growing more resolute. "I will hold your head, give you water, and watch over you day and night. When you die, I will bury you in the nearby field, and water your grave with tears for your incomparable worth and untimely fate. And then I will lay down in your bed and wait for the same oblivion." Welbeck's tempestuous features calmed, and he paced the floor with less disorder than before. His resolution was one of despair, but I hoped that my remonstrances could sway him. While his attendance might alleviate the pain of death, it could also put his life in danger. I worried about his companion in the study and what their motives were for being here. "Your decision to stay is hasty and rash," I said to Welbeck. "Persisting in your actions will only add to the misery of my condition and take away the only hope I cherished. But regardless of your decision, either Colville or I must be banished from this roof. What is the connection between you two? I implore you to break it before his deceit leads you to inescapable ruin," I pleaded with Welbeck. Welbeck looked at me skeptically before I continued. "I heard a man's voice above us. He is a villain and betrayer. I have numerous proofs of his guilt. Why does he remain?" "You heard no one but myself," Welbeck replied. "I came alone and desired to escape detection. I counted your request for entry in a disguised voice. It belonged to someone I had recently parted with, whom I do not know well. He found me in the forests of New Jersey and took me in when I was ill. After I somewhat recovered, I came here, but we were both unaware of each other's character and intentions." My suspicions of Welbeck's deception were strong, but his earnest declarations eventually convinced me. If Colville was not present, where had he gone? The uncertainty lingered in my mind. How did friendship and connection develop between Welbeck and him? How did Welbeck miraculously escape from the river, where I had believed him to be forever submerged? "I will tell you," he replied honestly. "You already know enough about me that I have no interest in concealing any part of my life. You have discovered my existence, and the events that saved me from destruction can be revealed without harming my reputation or well-being. When I leaped into the river, I intended to drown. I had no doubts about my ability to carry out my fatal plan. However, I was deceived in this regard. Suffocation did not come as I desired. My muscles and limbs resisted my will. There was an instinctual resistance to the loss of life that I could not overcome. My struggles would submerge me momentarily, but my lips instinctively sealed shut, preventing the torrent from entering my lungs. When my breath was depleted, my involuntary efforts to stay submerged ceased, and I resurfaced. I cursed my own cowardice. Thrice I dove to the depths, and thrice I resurfaced. My aversion to life gradually diminished, and eventually I consented to employ my exceptional swimming skills to prolong my existence. Within a few minutes, I reached the shores of Jersey. With this plan foiled, I sank into a state of desolation and inaction. I felt as if I could no longer rely on my own courage, as if any attempt I made at self-destruction would be futile. Yet, existence remained devoid of joy and purpose. My means of sustenance were gone, and I saw no clear path ahead. My greatest desire was to avoid the presence of other human beings. Since I could not end my life by my own hand, I resigned myself to crawl through existence until a greater fate would grant me release. I wandered deep into the heart of the forest. I laid myself down on the mossy edge of a brook and gazed at the stars until they vanished from sight. The following day passed with little variation. Hunger pangs began to gnaw at me, and strangely enough, that sensation brought me joy, as it provided me with a practical means of achieving death. Refraining from food was simple, since it would require effort to procure it, and I had no intention of making such efforts. Thus, the sweet oblivion I yearned for was within reach. 3 days of abstinence, contemplation, and solitude followed. On the evening of the 4th day, I sat on a rock with my face buried in my hands. Someone placed a hand on my shoulder, causing me to startle and look up. Before me was a face radiating compassion and kindness. He tried to coax from me the reason for my isolation and sorrow. I ignored his pleas and stubbornly remained silent. Seeing that I was unyielding, he invited me to his nearby cottage. I initially rebuffed him with impatience and anger, but he could not be discouraged or intimidated. To avoid his persuasions, I reluctantly acquiesced. My strength had waned, and my fragile body was crumbling. A fever raged within me, and I found solace in the realization that my life was under attack from both famine and disease. Meanwhile, my somber thoughts found no respite. I constantly dwelled on the events of my past life. The long string of my crimes resurfaced daily in my mind. The image of Lodi appeared, his dying gaze and the instructions we had exchanged regarding his sister and her inheritance. As I incessantly pondered these incidents, they took on new forms and became intertwined with fresh associations. I also recalled the volume written by Lodi's father, which had been entrusted to me through gestures that now seemed more significant than the nature of the composition warranted. As I sat there, memories flooded my mind of a volume I had filled with extracts from the ancient Roman and Greek poets during my youth. Along with my literary pursuits, I also used to keep bank bills in it that I was entrusted with for safekeeping or transport. This memory led me to the leather case that held Lodi's property, which was given to me at the same time as the volume. Suddenly, a new idea struck me like a lightning bolt. Could it be possible that part of Lodi's property was hidden within the pages of this book? Frantically flipping through the pages, I recalled seeing some leaves that were stuck together by accident or design. Lodi had mentioned that the sale of his father's West Indian property had fetched a sum of $40,000, of which only half had been discovered by me. Where had the rest gone? Surely it must be hidden within this volume. This thought breathed new life into my body, which had been consumed by illness and despair. My desperation for a cure was now replaced with newfound hope and energy. However, I was not without regrets and fears. The possibility of creditors or thieves stealing the book loomed over my head. Every passing moment could be the one that decided my fate. The first thing I wanted to do was to go back to my home and retrieve this precious item. But my impatience and anxiety only worsened my condition, and I was confined to my bed. Meanwhile, rumors of pestilence spread throughout the city. Though it was a calamitous event, it was a stroke of luck for me. The outbreak meant that my house and belongings were less likely to be targeted by looters. My friend was a constant source of comfort and support during these trying times. Before and after my hopes were revived, my behavior was incomprehensible and could only be described as madness. I kept my thoughts hidden from him, so all he saw was confusion and contradiction. Eventually my strength returned, and I refused to delay my departure any longer despite my protector's pleas. I planned to enter the city at midnight to avoid any prying eyes. I brought a candle to light my way to my old study and discover my future fate. This morning I crossed the river without waiting until evening. I thought it was safe since the city was desolate. The house was closed, but I found an unlocked window shutter in the back court. Closets and cabinets were empty, and my heart sank. I knew my books had likely suffered the same fate. My blood boiled as I approached the study and opened the door. My hopes were briefly revived upon seeing my shelves still intact. I had lit my candle below to avoid drawing attention, but my eyes searched for the volume. It was gone, and my dreams were shattered forever. To describe my confusion and frustration, to curse my own foolishness for letting this treasure slip through my fingers, and to blame the interference that had taken it away, would only add to my disappointment and sorrow. "You discovered me in this state, and what followed is known to you," he finished. The story shed new light on Welbeck's character. If he had stumbled upon this treasure by chance, it was easy to predict the lavish and self-centered ways in which he would have spent it. His reliance on the world's incorrect assessments and his devotion to deceit, coupled with a disregard for the future, would have defined his future life as it had his past. This money belonged to someone else, and it would have been criminal to use it for his own purposes. But he seemed as unaware of this crime as ever. His own satisfaction was the guiding principle behind all his actions. Being forced into honest labor was the worst of all evils, and one he was willing to escape by committing suicide. The volume he was after belonged to me. It was my responsibility to return it to its rightful owner, or if that person could not be found, to use it to promote virtue and happiness. Giving it to Welbeck would have consecrated it to the purpose of selfishness and misery. Legally, my right to it was as valid as his. But if I didn't intend to give it to him, was it right to reveal the truth and explain who had stolen it from the shelf? My first instinct was to keep this truth hidden, but recent events have taught me to question the justice and usefulness of secrecy in any situation. My principles were sound and my motives pure. Why should I hesitate to declare my principles and justify my actions? Welbeck was no longer feared or respected. The awe that once surrounded him due to his age, manners, and attire had vanished. Even as a young, impoverished, and uneducated country boy, I possessed the ability to discern the illusions of power and wealth. I renounced any claim to respect that was not rooted in integrity. There was no tribunal before which I would hesitate to speak the truth, and I was prepared to embrace any form of martyrdom in its pursuit. After a moment of contemplation, I spoke up. "Can you not speculate on how this volume has disappeared?" "No," he sighed. "The inexplicable enigma is why, out of all his volumes, only this one has vanished." "Perhaps," I suggested, "it is more important to discover who currently possesses it than how it was taken." "Undoubtedly, yet unless that knowledge allows me to regain possession, it serves no purpose." "In that case, it will indeed be useless, for the current possessor will never return it to you." Welbeck looked at me with a mix of anxiety and uncertainty at my words. "You know it will not be returned. Do you have any knowledge of the book? Can you tell me what has become of it?" "Yes. After our parting on the river, I returned to this house. I found the volume and secured it. Your suspicions about its contents were correct. The money was inside." Welbeck reacted as if he had stumbled upon a gold mine. His initial elation quickly gave way to doubt. "What happened to it? Do you have it? Is it intact? Do you possess it now?" "It remains unharmed. I have it in my possession, and I will safeguard it as a sacred duty for the rightful owner." The tone accompanying my declaration shook Welbeck's newfound confidence. "The rightful owner? Yes, that is true, and that is me. The manuscript belongs to me alone, and I am sure you will be willing to return it to me," said Mr. Welbeck. "I do not wish to cause you any distress or confusion or to play with your emotions. I believe that it was not unjust to take the manuscript after your supposed death. However, I stumbled upon its contents by accident, and I knew that I had to act. Vincentio Lodi's sister is his natural and legal heir, and therefore the rightful owner of this property. I will give it to her and her alone," I stated emphatically. "You are a presumptuous boy," exclaimed Mr. Welbeck. "Your decision is foolish and unwise. I am the owner of this manuscript, and you must return it to me. Who is this girl? She is childish and ignorant, unable to make even the smallest decisions for herself. As her guardian and protector, appointed by her dying brother, I have the legal right to control her assets. Her age makes her incapable of owning property. Do you think that I overlooked the obvious solution of becoming her legal guardian? Even if I didn't, I still have the right to provide for her and ensure her happiness. Did I not rescue her from poverty, prostitution, and infamy? Have I not provided for her every need with great care? The house and its furnishings are hers, as far as the law allows. It is the duty of her guardian to manage her finances and control her household. You have heard of my anguish and despair. It is the result of my frustration with schemes that were meant to benefit her, but were executed with her money and under my authority as her guardian. Why have I come to this place like a thief, if not to rescue her from poverty and give her what is rightfully hers? Your scruples are both ridiculous and criminal. My treatment of you will be less harsh, as I understand that your youth has left you inexperienced and your ideas still unrefined. However, if you refuse to return the money after recognizing the validity of my claim, I will have no choice but to regard you as a thief who has robbed me and refuses to make amends, Welbeck said, exasperated. These arguments were both convincing and novel. As someone familiar with the concept of guardianship, I knew that Welbeck had in some ways acted as a friend to this woman. It was only natural that he would take on the role of her guardian, given her youth and vulnerability. As such, his claim to this money was undoubtedly legitimate. However, I couldn't help but wonder why he had failed to mention any of this before. If he truly was her guardian, then his actions would have contradicted his previous efforts to gain the admiration and respect of others. These thoughts left me feeling quite perplexed. If his claims were true, then his right to the money was beyond question. However, I couldn't shake my doubts about his honesty. To voice these suspicions would surely only provoke outrage and disgust. Furthermore, his final insinuation was particularly weighty. What if he was actually the one who had obtained the money through dishonest means? Would I be justified in taking it from him by force, even if I claimed to be returning it to the true owner, who may very well be dead or impossible to locate? Would my actions in this case be considered justifiable, or would they be seen as criminal? I remained silent, lost in thought. Welbeck grew increasingly impatient, his demands growing more and more forceful. I knew I had to say something, but my indecision persisted. I informed him briefly that his arguments had not convinced me of the fairness of his claim, and that my decision had not changed. He was surprised by my stubbornness, given my current state of weakness and isolation. He saw my opposition as foolish, especially when compared to his own resources and capabilities. However, his disdain turned to anger and fear when he realized that my resistance could ruin his plans. He had likely decided to take the money by force if necessary, but wanted to try peaceful means first. He may have also doubted whether the money was actually in my possession. Although I had told him I had it, he couldn't be sure if I still had it with me. Despite not asking directly, he continued to act as if I did. His angry tone shifted to one of persuasion and remonstration. Your current behavior, Slaught, is not what I expected of you. You've committed a despicable theft, and you've compounded it with ingratitude. However, your foolishness and delusion are just as evident as your wrongdoing. Do you expect me to believe that you're holding on to this money for someone else when it's been 6 weeks since you took it? Why haven't you tried to return it to its rightful owner? If your intentions were pure, you wouldn't have waited so long. You intended to keep it for yourself. Regardless of your intentions, you can no longer keep or return the money. You claim to have come here to die. What will happen to the money then? You're in no position to give it back to the lady. Someone else will inherit this wealth. Who could rival my claim to Signora Lodi's trust if not me? But if you refuse to give it to me on my own merit, then let me be the one to deliver it to her. I've already proven that my position as her guardian is legitimate and indisputable, but I am willing to waive that claim. I only ask to be the executor of your will, and to fulfill your wishes to the best of my ability. I swear to follow your directives, no matter how daunting or serious, to the letter. Though I knew I was innocent, the accusations of dishonesty that were leveled at me did not bother me much. They did not anger me because they were based on ignorance, and were made plausible to Welbeck by the few facts he knew. I did not feel the need to refute the charges with a detailed explanation because I knew that my recovery was unlikely, and my death would mean the end of my control over the money. But I had already planned to ensure that the money was put to good use even after my death. My plan was hindered by Welbeck's presence, but I hoped that his love for life would compel him to leave. He could try to take the money from me by force, or he might wait until I died to claim it. But these were not certain events, and did not justify my voluntary surrender. Though he could overpower me, it would not be a choice but a necessity. Promises were easy to make but hard to keep. Welbeck's own story, in which he had not exaggerated his flaws, proved the frailty of his character. To place such a sum of money in Welbeck's hands, expecting him to deliver it to another when my death would render the transaction completely secret, would indeed be proof of the very folly and infatuation that he had accused me of. These thoughts guided my decisions, but I kept them to myself. Expressing them verbally would be futile. They would not justify my actions in Welbeck's eyes. They would only escalate the dispute and incite him to the acts of violence that I sought to prevent. The sooner this conflict ended, and I could be freed to some extent from his company, the better. "Mr. Welbeck," I said, "my concern for your safety compels me to wish for this meeting to come to an end. At another time I would be willing to discuss this matter, but now it would be pointless. My conscience clearly shows me the path I must follow, and I cannot mistake it. As long as I have control over this money, I will keep it for the benefit of the unfortunate lady I have seen in this house. I will make every effort to find her, but if that proves impossible, I will allocate it in a way that excludes your involvement. I will not recount the contest that ensued between my restraint and his passions. I listened to his rage and greed in silence. Astonishment at my unwavering resolve mingled with his anger. At times his emotions would escalate into fury, and he would approach me in a threatening manner, raising his hand as if to strike me. My weary eyes, flushed cheeks, throbbing temples, and complete passivity caught his attention and stayed his blow. Compassion would replace rage, and he would once again believe that reasoning and persuasion could serve his purpose. The scene dragged on. I couldn't say for how long. Gradually, Welbeck's emotions and arguments shifted, morphing into a new form. Grief mingled with confusion spread across his face. He stopped fighting and speaking, his gaze no longer fixed on me. Instead, it wandered aimlessly, betraying a conflict beyond anything my young mind could imagine. For a while he seemed unaware of my presence. He paced back and forth with uneven steps, gesturing wildly, his movements hinting at some terrible yet indistinct meaning. Every so often he gasped for air, as if trying to remove some choking obstacle. This was the ultimate test of my fortitude. The suspicion his behavior aroused was vague yet ominous. The tempest I witnessed was just the beginning of a horror story. These were the throes that would give birth to some monstrous and bloody purpose. Was he contemplating a violent sacrifice? Was he planning to take his own life or mine in a fit of despair or rage? Suicide was a familiar notion to him. He had agreed to live only on the condition that he regained possession of the money. Would I be justified in driving him to commit such a heinous crime by refusing to budge? But my fear of this outcome was unfounded. So far, he had tried to reason and persuade me, choosing this method over force or delay. No, it was clear that I was the target of his rage. Some unknown impetus was pushing him to abandon his humanity and become my killer. I couldn't fathom how accumulating guilt could make him feel secure or satisfied. His actions had been partially revealed, but they remained vague and unclear. As I contemplated these thoughts, my blood coursed through my veins with increased speed. I lifted my head from the pillow and observed the behavior of this man with heightened attention. The paroxysm that had gripped him began to subside to some extent. He muttered, "Yes, it must happen. My final humiliation must consume me. I must make my ultimate confession. I cannot die and leave behind this trail of enormous perils. O Clemenza, O Slaught, you do not deserve to inherit a legacy of persecution and death. Your safety must be secured at whatever price my malicious fate demands. The hangman's noose, the eternal stain of infamy, would be preferable to leaving you ensnared by the consequences of my guilt. It must not be." Uttering these words, Welbeck cast fearful glances around the room, scrutinizing every entrance and listening intently. Thrice he repeated this examination. Once he seemed to confirm that no one lurked within earshot, he approached the bed. He brought his mouth close to my face, attempting to speak, but he again surveyed the room with suspicious glances. Drawing nearer, in a barely intelligible and emotionally stifled tone, he spoke, "Excellent but fatally stubborn youth. At the very least, know the reason behind my urgency. Understand the depths of my infatuation and the enormity of my guilt. The bills, surrender them to me and save yourself from persecution and disgrace. Save the woman whom you wish to help from the darkest accusations, from the perils to her life and reputation, from languishing in dungeons, from dying on the gallows. He paused, choking back his words. The bills. Oh, save me from the bitterness of death. Let the evils born from my wretched life end here in me. Surrender them to me for... And there he stopped. His words were choked by terror, and once again he darted rapid glances at the windows and door. The silence remained undisturbed, except for the distant sounds of a moving carriage. Summoning his resolve once more, he spoke again. Surrender them to me, for they are forged. Previously I mentioned to you that a forgery scheme had been devised. Shame prevented me from admitting that I had actually carried out that scheme. The bills were created, but my fears battled against my needs, preventing me from attempting to cash them. The encounter with Lodi saved me from the dangerous experiment. I enclosed the bills in that volume as a means of future wealth, to be used only when all other, less risky options had failed. In the throes of remorse over Watson's death, I forgot about the bills. They later came back to my memory. My desire was to find the grave, but the act that would deliver me from life was postponed until I could hasten here, gain possession of those papers, and destroy them. When I considered the possibility that they could end up in someone else's hands, be put into circulation, burden the innocent with suspicion, and lead them to trial and perhaps death, my sensations were filled with agony. Even though I longed for death, it was necessary to delay it until I had obtained and destroyed those papers. Now what remains? You have found them. Fortunately, they have not been used. Therefore, give them to me so that I can crush the brood of mischief they would undoubtedly create. This disclosure was astonishing. It was accompanied by every indication of sincerity. How close I had come to destruction. If I had used that money, I could have been plunged into a labyrinth of misery. My innocence could never have been proven, and an association with Welbeck would have been inevitably inferred. My entire future would have been tainted with ignominy, and even if my punishment had been transformed into slavery and toil, would my conscience have been able to sustain me? The mere thought of those calamities sent shivers down my spine, from which I was miraculously saved by the chance that led me to this house. Welbeck's request was beneficial to me and reflected honor upon himself. I wouldn't hesitate for a moment to comply. The banknotes were wrapped in paper and placed in a fold of my clothing. I laid my hand upon them. However, at that very moment, my movement and attention were interrupted by a noise emanating from the street. Footsteps echoed on the pavement in front of the door, accompanied by voices engaged in conversation. This incident instilled deep alarm in both myself and my companion. Though our reasons for trepidation differed, my concerns far outweighed his. It seemed to foreshadow the loss of my sanctuary and my condemnation to a hospital. Welbeck hurried to the door to listen to the conversation below, leaving me to ponder in that interim. My thoughts momentarily shifted from Welbeck to my own predicament, allowing me to contemplate the terms of the confession that had just been made. Horror consumed me as I contemplated the fate I had managed to evade through this encounter. I was eager to surrender those fateful bills. Holding them in my hand, I anxiously awaited Welbeck's return. He remained at the door, stooped with his face turned away, intently listening to the conversation in the street. Every aspect of my present situation conspired to halt the progression of thought and confine my contemplations to a single image. Yet even at this moment, there was space for foresight and deliberation. Welbeck intended to destroy those bills. Maybe he hadn't been truthful, or maybe his intentions would change once he had the bills in his possession. His poverty and optimism might lead him to use them, even though it was clearly wrong and would only make things worse. Why should I subject him to such temptation? It was my duty to destroy the bills for the sake of everyone's well-being. It was an easy task with a candle nearby. I didn't hesitate for a moment to get rid of such a powerful source of trouble. I got up from my bed and went to the table. Taking the notes with my right hand, I held them to the flame of the candle, then threw them on the floor, where they continued to burn. Welbeck noticed the sudden light and quickly realized what had happened. He rushed over and stomped out the fire with his foot, but it was too late. Only a few scraps remained to reveal the nature of the sacrifice. Welbeck stood there, trembling and staring at me with a look of horror. He was speechless for a while, but then he erupted in anger. "You monster! What have you done?" he shouted. "I did what was right. Those notes were fake. You wanted to get rid of them so they wouldn't hurt anyone innocent. I agreed with your plan and destroyed them myself so you wouldn't be tempted," I replied. "You lunatic! You fool! You fell for such a cheap trick. The notes were real. The story of their forgery was a lie, fabricated solely to take them away from you. You despicable and twisted fool. Your actions have sealed my downfall. They have sealed your own. You will pay for it with your life. I will slowly kill you, just as you have slowly killed me, torturing you until your last breath." As Welbeck ranted, his face twisted with rage. It was clear that this scene would end in a bloody catastrophe. I regretted my gullibility and the haste with which I had made my sacrifice. But there was no turning back now. I would have to face the consequences with unwavering bravery, even though the odds were stacked against me. Perhaps Welbeck's frenzy would have subsided eventually, but it was more likely that he would only be satisfied with my death. However, our confrontation was interrupted by loud knocking at the door and calls from someone outside. "Who's in there? Is anyone inside?" These sounds redirected Welbeck's attention. "They're coming," he said. "They'll treat you like a sick man and a thief. I can't wish a worse fate upon you than what they'll do. I leave you to your own fate." And with that, he stormed out of the room. Though I was stunned by the rapid turn of events, I quickly took action to avoid the unwelcome visitors. I snuffed out the light, and hearing the commotion outside growing louder, I sought refuge in the farthest corner of the house. During my previous stay, I had noticed a trapdoor in the ceiling of the third floor, accessible by a movable ladder. I suspected it led to a cramped, dark space formed by the roof's angle. Closing the door behind me, I carefully ascended the ladder with a sense of urgency. My disease had weakened me, but my determination gave me strength. I reached the top room and climbed the ladder to a safe distance from any potential search. The ladder was quickly retracted, and the door shut tight. However, my new hiding spot proved to be worse than the one before. The air was thick and hot, making it difficult to breathe. I knew I couldn't stay here for more than a few minutes before suffocation set in. My fear of being discovered blinded me to the dangers of this bleak hiding place. I needed to get out quickly. I tried to lift the door, but it wouldn't budge. My breathing became more and more labored, but my fear and determination gave me the strength to keep trying. Finally, my shaking hand found a loose nail that gave me the leverage I needed to lift the door and breathe in the fresh air. I listened carefully for any signs of intruders or danger, but heard nothing. I concluded that it was safe to return to my previous hiding place without risking discovery. Before I left, I examined the small space more closely. It was just big enough for a person to hide in, and the entrance was easily concealed. Though it was narrow and low, it was long enough that, with proper ventilation, it could provide perfect protection for someone seeking to remain hidden. My examination was imperfect due to the dim light filtering through the opening, but it was enough to ignite my curiosity and test my courage. Slaught paused in his tale, leaving me in silence and uncertainty for a moment before continuing. "I have promised to recount the pivotal events of my life thus far, and I have been truthful in my retelling. Nothing repulses me more than deception or secrecy. However, I fear that I may be accused of such things now. I could have avoided your speculation by omitting the events that occurred between leaving my chamber and returning to it. I could have lied and claimed that nothing noteworthy happened, but that would have been untrue. Honesty is paramount, and I must admit that the brief period of time and my cursory inspection provided me with a wealth of information that I eagerly devoured. The implications of what I saw and the deductions I made may impact my future and my very existence. For now, it is best to keep these findings to myself, but I must confess that my curiosity was insatiable, and the consequences of my discoveries may be dire. Nonetheless, there was nothing to keep me in that location. I descended to the lower level and collapsed onto the bed I had previously occupied. My mind was awash with the images and thoughts that arose from my recent exploit. My fever had escalated, and my mind was plagued with a lack of clarity and order. Despite this, my heart remained steady when I considered my own circumstances. It was clear to me that I would soon become immobile and unable to move. The future was crystal clear, and I knew that I would be stuck in this bleak and empty solitude with no hope of restoratives or relief from my agony, only begging for water to soothe my parched lips and ease my thirst. I was resigned to my fate, knowing that I would expire in either a state of paralysis or madness. But I was not afraid. It was as if I was given a supernatural energy to combat these evils, and while no one would witness my bravery, the knowledge that I deserved praise was enough to satisfy my ambition. I knew that these thoughts were a sign of my delirium, The excruciating pain in my head and the tightness in my chest, which I imagined was someone trying to strangle me, were not compatible with a clear and sober mind. My thirst was the most pressing issue. My body and habits told me that the solution was to refill my pitcher with water from the well. However, I soon realized that it was easier said than done. My body refused to cooperate, and I collapsed on the lower step of the staircase. Night had fallen by this point, and in my disorientation, I came up with a new plan. Medlicott was a brave and generous soul, and seeking his protection seemed like the best course of action. Despite my earlier reservations, I set out on this seemingly impossible journey, ignoring the fact that I could not walk such a distance and the danger of being caught in the streets. The doors leading to the courtyard and the street were secured with bolts inside. These were easily removed, and I eagerly stepped out with confidence. However, my distressed state and the darkness made it difficult for me to find the right path. I acknowledged this challenge, but it didn't discourage me. I continued on, unaware that I was heading in the wrong direction, until I became too weak to move and collapsed on the ground. I closed my eyes and let go of all fear and worry about the future. I remained in that state for several hours and would have likely perished if it weren't for your intervention. You noticed me and brought me under your roof, where I received expert medical care and the kindest attention. Thanks to your efforts, I was restored to health and vitality. Your actions were motivated by a desire to help, not by the hope of a reward, service, or gratitude. The only way I can express my appreciation for your kindness is to prove that I am not a worthless and immoral person, despite being uneducated and poor. I will not squander the life you have given me on harmful or trivial pursuits. Chapter 18. Part 2. The narrative of Slaught came to an end, and it was clear that the events that unfolded were anything but ordinary. Being in the midst of a pandemic provided me with ample opportunities to observe, and I made sure to make the most of them. While the incidents I personally witnessed shared similarities with the ones just recounted, they did not detract from the impact of the story. Instead, they served as evidence that what I had heard was indeed true. The young man in the tale exhibited remarkable and admirable traits. His bravery came from a place of kindness and logic, rather than being a product of apathy or routine. He had faced enormous dangers without any formal training. He stepped onto the stage unprepared, with no experience in protecting himself from fraud. Yet, with his pure intentions, he managed to outsmart an experienced and cunning deceiver. I thanked fate for bringing this young man under my wing. When I thought about the chain of events that led him to me and how I saved someone with such rare abilities, my heart swelled with joy, mixed with regret and trepidation. How many virtuous and talented people have succumbed to this disease? How many heroic acts and selfless deeds have been lost to oblivion? I had saved his life, but that was not enough. I could make his life worthwhile and beneficial to himself and society. Although my profession did not make me rich, I could still provide for his needs while teaching him the necessary skills to become a doctor. The study of medicine, which encompasses the natural world and benefits humanity, would appeal to his kind and driven nature. I came up with this plan as soon as he finished telling me his story. However, I did not mention it immediately, as I needed to get my wife's approval first. I was sure she would agree. For the time being, I put the idea aside and focused on the young man's tale. The woman whom Welbeck had betrayed and abandoned was not a stranger to me. I knew her fate all too well. If she had been alone during her misfortune, people would have sympathized with her greatly. But the more people witness scenes of distress, the less compassion they seem to have. Now that those scenes are only memories, my pain is even greater than when I witnessed them. Every day was just a repeat of the disasters from the day before. My sensitivity was dulled, and I looked at the complex issues of poverty and sickness with a degree of apathy that would have once astonished me. The story of Clemenza Lodi was not more exceptional than many others. It shed a terrible light on the character of Welbeck, and showed him to be even more inhumane than the story of Slaught had suggested. That man had been seen only partially until then. The time had not yet come to reveal the enormity of his crimes and the complexity of his frauds. There was a woman named Villars who lived in a remote area of the city. She claimed to be the widow of an English officer, and her manners and lifestyle seemed respectable. She had 3 daughters who were well educated and elegant in appearance and behavior. They had recently arrived from Europe, and were initially respected by their neighbors for their education and wealth. However, suspicions began to arise that their income did not come from pensions or inheritance, but from prostitution. Men began to visit their home secretly, and one of these men was related to me. I had the authority to watch his actions and correct his mistakes. He told me the truth about these women. A man with a voracious appetite for debauchery like Welbeck could not resist the allure of innocence and beauty for long. He stumbled upon this family by accident, and the youngest daughter became his target for manipulation. It was her constant demands for money that contributed to the financial troubles that plagued Slaught. Welbeck was desperate to rid himself of the burden of the young woman and sought to transfer her to someone else. It's not hard to imagine why he kept his connection with Lucy Villas a secret from Slaught. As for Clemenza's asylum, it's no surprise that Welbeck remained tight-lipped since she was placed with Mrs. Villas. The conditions under which she was taken in are unknown, but it's safe to assume that they hoped to exploit her vulnerability and eventually involve her in their immoral schemes. The outbreak of a deadly disease panicked them, and they fled to avoid contracting it. Mrs. Villas was a woman with grand ambitions who resorted to despicable means to amass wealth. However, she used her riches to secure independence for herself and her daughters. She purchased a house in the city and a magnificent mansion in the suburbs, where she and her family, including the Italian girl, retired in July. I learned all of this from a relative who strayed from the path of righteousness due to his youthful passions. He could confess and regret his mistakes, but he lacked the power to correct them. One of these women had him under a spell he couldn't shake, and despite his efforts to resist, he found himself at her feet, sacrificing his reputation and fortune for her pleasure. He would often stay at my house when he wasn't practicing his profession, but before the infection began to spread, he disappeared without a trace. It wasn't until a messenger arrived, pleading for my help, that I learned of his whereabouts. He had been holed up in the house of Mrs. Villas, alone except for my kinsman. The family had abandoned him when he fell ill with the disease, leaving him to his fate. His despair and sickness consumed him, but before he passed, he revealed the identity of his betrayers. He spoke of Clemenza Lodi's arrival, and described Welbeck in a way that made it clear he was Lucy Villas' paramour and the mastermind behind their crimes. Slaught was intrigued by my knowledge of Clemenza's fate, and pressed for more information. As I shared what I knew, he fell into deep thought. When he emerged from his reverie, he spoke urgently. Her situation is dire. Welbeck's poverty will force him to leave her, and her wicked protectors will either lure her to destruction or abandon her altogether. Can she be saved? I don't know how, I replied. The solution is simple, he said. She must flee to another dwelling. She must be warned of the evil around her and urged to escape. The means are obvious. She should relocate to a different place. She needs to be informed about the vices of those surrounding her. She should be encouraged to flee. Once she is inspired and aware of the danger, she will be safe by moving away from it. As much as I was touched and truly impressed with his zeal to rescue Clemenza, I had to present him with the harsh realities of his rescue plan. You are a daring youth. Whom will you find to undertake this task? Who will be persuaded to enter a stranger's house, approach this girl without an introduction, inform her that the place she lives in is a house of prostitution, convince her to believe this tale, and persuade her to leave with them? Who will provide shelter to a fugitive? Who will be convinced that her involvement with Welbeck, evident through the disgraceful signs, hasn't made her unfit for the company of prostitutes and unworthy of protection? Who will welcome a stranger into their family, someone whose actions have brought infamy upon her, and whose current associates have likely made her deserving of such a fate? True, these are obstacles I did not foresee. Must she then perish? Shouldn't we do something to rescue her from infamy and guilt? Slaught replied, frustrated yet unwilling to give up. Neither you nor I have the power to do anything about it, I said dejectedly. At that late hour, our conversation ended, and we retired to rest. I took the first opportunity to share with my wife the plan that had come to mind concerning our guest, and as I expected, she agreed readily. The next morning I mentioned it to Slaught. I emphasized the benefits associated with the medical profession, the ability to alleviate the suffering of our neighbors, the respect it commands, the potential for financial stability, the freedom from menial worries it provides, and the intellectual gratification it offers. As I spoke, his eyes filled with joy. Yes, he said fervently, "I willingly accept your offer," he replied with joy in his eyes. "Yes," he said fervently, "I willingly accept your offer," he replied with joy in his eyes. "I accept this opportunity because I recognize that rejecting it would make me less worthy than you believe, and would cause you pain instead of the pleasure I'm obliged to bring you. I would like to begin the duties and studies of my new profession right away, but I have concerns about Mr. Hadwin and his daughters that can only be eased by returning to Malverton and seeing their condition with my own eyes. As you are aware, I parted with Wallace and Mr. Hadwin under uncertain circumstances. I cannot be certain if they made it home safely, nor can I discount the possibility that they may have carried the infection with them. However, I feel strong enough now to make the journey, and had intended to inform you of my plans during our meeting. There is no need for delay, and I hope you will allow me to depart immediately. A week or two of rural exercise and fresh air will do wonders for my health." We had no objections to his plan. Slaught's account of the Hadwins had stirred a deep affection within us, and his visit would not only provide us with an update on their condition, but also alleviate any anxieties they may have regarding our guest. It was a bit surprising that neither Wallace nor Hadwin had returned to the city to inquire about their friend's well-being. It was easier to assume they had been delayed by some misfortune rather than indifference or laziness. In a matter of minutes, Slaught bid us farewell and set off on his journey, promising to update us on the situation as soon as possible. We parted with him reluctantly, finding solace only in the thought of his swift return. During his absence, our conversations naturally revolved around the topics prompted by his story and demeanor. His two listeners, however, reached different conclusions. Both of them had developed a keen interest in Slaught's well-being, along with an insatiable curiosity about the details that his incomplete story had left in the dark. There was much speculation regarding Welbeck's true character and current situation. No one, including Slaught, could provide any information about whether he was dead or alive, close or far from his previous home. It was uncertain if he had met the same fate as those who had been collected from the streets and hovels to be buried in the pits, meant for both the rich and the poor, the known and the unknown. It was also unclear whether he had fled to a foreign land or was to reappear on the stage again. The disappearance of Watson, occurring on the eve of the epidemic, would usually trigger inquiries and suspicions. However, given the timing, his relatives and friends would readily believe that he had fallen victim to the general calamity and become one of its early casualties. Since individuals of his profession typically resided in the street where the infection originated and where it had caused the most devastation, this circumstance would further support their conclusions. I saw no immediate benefit in sharing the information I had recently acquired with anyone else. Soon after Slaught's departure to Malverton, Wortley paid me a visit. Upon inquiring about my guest, I informed him that he had recovered and left my abode. He continued to hurl insults at Welbeck, expressed his suspicions of Slaught, and expressed his desire for another meeting with the young man. He asked me why I had allowed him to leave and where he had gone. "He has taken a brief trip to the countryside," I replied. "I expect him to return in less than a week, and during that time you are welcome to meet with him here as often as you please, as I anticipate him taking up residence in this house." My friend expressed great astonishment and disapproval at this announcement. I hinted that Slaught had shared certain revelations with me that justified my trust in his integrity. However, these proofs of his honesty were not something I could disclose indiscriminately. Slaught had given me permission to share parts of his story with Wortley in order to vindicate himself from the accusation of being involved in Welbeck's fraudulent activities. However, presenting an incomplete narrative would only hinder that purpose, and providing a full account, although it might clear Slaught's name, could potentially create inconveniences that outweighed this advantage. Naturally, Wortley was far from satisfied with this explanation. He believed Slaught to be a cunning impostor, trained in the arts of fraud by an accomplished teacher. Wortley considered his tale to be a clever and plausible web of lies, and he argued that the mere assertions of someone with such strong suspicions against them were not worthy of any credit. "It cannot be denied," my friend continued, "that he lived with Welbeck at the time of his disappearance, that they disappeared together, and that they were seen boarding a boat at Pine Street Wharf at midnight. The boat was later discovered in the possession of a fisherman in Red Bank, who claimed to have found it stranded near his doorstep the day after they disappeared. I can provide you with undeniable evidence of all these facts. If, after seeing this evidence, you still choose to believe his story, Then I will think you are made of stubborn and gullible material. The proof you mention, I informed him, will only strengthen his credibility. All the facts you have stated have already been acknowledged by him. They are a crucial part of his tale, Wortley said gravely. So what can we conclude? Is there no evidence of a pact between them? Has he not admitted to this alliance by confessing that he knew Welbeck owed me money, that he was aware of his flight? Yet he had promised to keep it a secret and would never betray him. You claim that Welbeck plans to come back, but I highly doubt that. He is too clever to put himself in danger again. However, I do not lose hope of finding him. Old Thetford, Jameson, and I have sworn to track him down no matter where he goes. I have a strong feeling that he is not far away. We have received some information recently that has allowed us to follow his trail. He may try to avoid us, but if he does not end up in our trap, he will have the agility and cunning of the devil himself. Wortley's desire for revenge was not unfounded. He had spent the prime of his life earning a meager income, working hard and honestly. He had finally found himself in a position to marry the woman he had been engaged to for years, but poverty had kept them apart until then. Just as they had begun to enjoy their married life, his luck took a turn for the worse. Welbeck's deceit had brought him to the brink of bankruptcy. Jameson and Thetford, however, were wealthy, and I had just learned that they had a personal vendetta against Welbeck. He was the uncle of Slaught's unfortunate friend, and he was one of those who used money not as a means of trade, but as an object in and of itself. He had no stocks or merchandise to turn into cash. He found it tedious to trade $100 today for a barrel or a bale, and then exchange the barrel or bale for $110 tomorrow. It was much better to hand over the $100 for a piece of paper, which he could take to the money changers and get back 123 3/4. In short, this man's wealth came from the despair of honest folks and the schemes of crooks. At first, I didn't suspect how this man's shrewdness and tireless focus on his own interests could allow him to fall for Welbeck's trap. What, I asked, is old Thetford's case against Welbeck? It's a claim, he replied, that if proven, will send Welbeck to prison and hard labor for life. How? It's just a debt, isn't it? Haven't you heard? But that's no surprise. Luckily, you're free from the anxieties and upheavals of commerce. Your fortune doesn't depend on a foundation that a single gust of wind could wipe away, or 4 pen strokes could demolish. That old man of suspicions was talked into signing 3 notes for $800 each. The 8 was then cleverly changed to 18. They were deposited on time and in the right place, and the next day, Welbeck was credited for $5,373, which were handed over to his messenger an hour later. It's hard to say whether the old man's grief, shame, or fury is the strongest. He refuses all comfort except for revenge, and he'll get it at any cost. Jameson, who deals in the same trade as Thetford, was tricked in the same way, for the same amount, and on the same day. This Welbeck must have powers beyond those of ordinary mortals. Having grown old studying the foolishness and schemes of men, these veterans were still outsmarted. No one has sympathy for them. It would have been better if his deceit was limited to them, and he spared those who were honest and poor. It is his mistreatment of those who have earned their meager living without sacrificing their integrity that I despise him for, and I will rejoice in seeing him face the full consequences of the law. Wortley's obligations forced him to leave at this point. As I pondered these facts, I couldn't help but be amazed at the narrow escapes Slaught's virtue had encountered. I wasn't entirely convinced that his reputation or life was completely safe, or that the doubts that had already arisen about him could be easily dispelled. Only his own account, delivered with the simple yet powerful eloquence that we had witnessed, could clear him of the most severe accusations. Was there a court that wouldn't acquit him simply after hearing his defense? Surely the young man was honest. His story couldn't have been created out of thin air. However, what are the limits of deception? Nature doesn't set any boundaries on the imagination's combinations. A smooth exterior, a display of integrity, and a persuasive story are often presented in human interaction by cunning and slyness. Motivations are endlessly diverse, while actions remain the same, and a keen eye may easily identify and organize motivations that are suitable for defending any action that a human can commit. If I had heard Slaught's story from someone else or read it in a book, I might have been able to doubt its veracity. But as long as the impression of his tone, gestures, and expressions remained in my mind, this doubt was impossible. Evil may sometimes be ambiguous. Its facade may confuse the observer, Our judgment may falter and fluctuate, but Slaught's face is the reflection of a sincere heart. Whether calm or passionate, uncertain or confident, it is brimming with kindness and honesty. Observing his words might lead one to doubt their truth, but gazing upon his face while he spoke, one could not help but have faith. Nonetheless, it was feasible to seek evidence that either supported or refuted his story. By chance, I was acquainted with a family called Althorpe, who hailed from the same region where his father resided. I decided to pay them a visit, and in the course of our conversation, casually mentioned the name Slaught. Immediately, they recognized the name as belonging to one of their former neighbors. We discussed the tragic deaths of Slaught's wife and sons, as well as the seduction of his only daughter by Colville, along with the heart-rending events connected to the fate of this daughter. Intrigued by this information, I asked Mrs. Althorpe, a sensible and open-minded woman, if she had any knowledge of the current situation of the Slaught family. "I cannot provide much information," she replied. "Since my marriage, I have been spending a few weeks each summer at my father's place, but I am less curious about the affairs of my old neighbors than I used to be. However, I do recall hearing during my last visit there, amidst the fever outbreak, that Sawney Slaught had married again. His only son, an 18-year-old youth, seemed to take great offense at his father's actions, and treated the new wife with disrespect and disdain. Considering how children often perceive themselves as unjustly treated when their parent remarries, this behavior is not entirely surprising. However, it was hinted that the boy's jealousy and discontent stemmed from an unusual cause. The new wife, who was not much older than him, had previously worked as a servant in the family, and a scandalous intimate relationship had developed between her and the son during that time. Their marriage, in the eyes of the neighbors, was rightly seen as a depraved and repugnant affair. The son, in such a situation, might have had reason to express his disapproval, but his anger should not have manifested to the extreme degree that has been described. It is said that he sneered at her with contempt, and even called her derogatory names in front of his father and strangers. It was impossible for such a family to stay together. One night Martin took the opportunity to abscond, taking all his father's money and riding away on the best horse in the meadow. For a while no one knew where he had gone. Eventually someone claimed to have spotted him in the streets of this city, transformed from a rural boy into a fine gentleman. This transformation seemed to have happened in an instant, as he left the countryside on a Saturday morning, and was seen the next day wearing a fashionable French coat and silk stockings, entering Christ's Church. I suppose he lived extravagantly as long as his money lasted. My father visited us last week, and among other news from the countryside, he informed us that Sawney Slaught had sold his property. His wife had convinced him to try his luck in the western country. The money from selling his 100-acre property here would buy him 1,000 acres there, and the man, being rather crude and ignorant and also quite gullible, did not realize that a square rod of land on Squealkill is far superior to an acre in Tennessee. It turned out that the woman was a cunning and immoral person. After selling the property and obtaining the money, she left him and fled to the city, wanting to enjoy the funds with greater security. This left him to continue his journey to Kentucky without money or companionship. Sometime later, Mr. Althorpe and I were at the theater when he pointed out a group of women in an upper box, among them being Betty Lawrence. It was difficult to recognize the same Betty who used to sell potatoes and manage her basket of cantaloupes in the Jersey market, now adorned with ribbons and sparkling with jewelry. Her companions were of questionable reputation. If Martin was still in the city, there is no doubt that the mother and son could renew their previous acquaintanceship. The old man, robbed and betrayed, sought solace in excessive drinking, a habit he had always indulged in. He roamed from one tavern to another until his credit was exhausted, and then he was sent to jail, where I believe he is likely to remain until his death. Such, my friend, is the story of the Slaughts. What evidence, I asked, do you have of the son's immoral behavior, his mistreatment of his mother and his elopement with his father's horse and money? I have no evidence other than the unanimous accounts from Slaught's neighbors. Respected and honest men have attested in my presence to witnessing the boy treating his mother in the manner I described. Furthermore, I was once in the company of the old man, and heard him passionately condemn his son, accusing him of stealing his horse and money. I distinctly remember tears welling up in his eyes as he spoke. As for being seen in the city the day after his escape, dressed lavishly and stylishly, I have as little doubt about that as I do about the rest. The person who saw him was my father, and you, who know my father, understand the credibility of his observations and his word. The man had seen Martin on numerous occasions, and he was certain that he was not mistaken. He described Martin's appearance in great detail. The boy was undeniably handsome, with dark hazel eyes, auburn hair, and elegant proportions. His demeanor was not that of a clown. If you were to take away his jacket and trousers, you would find a well-groomed young man who could have just as easily come from a dancing school or a college. He looked exactly like his mother, and was the polar opposite of his father, who had sturdy legs, a squat figure, and a broad, sheepish face. His appearance was a strong indication that his father's claims were correct. The clothes he was wearing could not have been obtained through legitimate means. It was likely that they were either purchased or stolen. What was this boy like before his mother's death and his father's remarriage? He was asked. He didn't have much going for him in terms of character or intellect, the man replied. As the youngest son and the only one to survive, he was his mother's favorite. He had a weak constitution and preferred to wander in the woods rather than plow or sow. This idleness went against his father's wishes and was the root of all his problems. When he did attempt to do something, it was done clumsily and showed that his thoughts were elsewhere. When he was needed, he was always difficult to find. He was usually discovered taking a stroll along a riverbank or lounging in the shade of a tree. It was very strange for such a young man to have such a disposition towards inactivity and laziness. People his age nowadays are hardly ever fond of work, but they do enjoy keeping company and engaging in sports and exercises. They ride horses, shoot guns, or simply have fun. However, this particular person spent all his time in solitude, never associating with other young people, never riding a horse unless he had no other choice, and never firing a gun or fishing in his life. Some people thought he was half an idiot, or at least not right in his mind. Indeed, his behavior was so strange and contrary that it's no wonder people thought that way. But surely, I said, he must have had some object of pursuit. Maybe he was addicted to books. Far from it. On the contrary, he hated school as much as he hated the plow. He never did his lessons or tolerated the slightest constraint. His mother indulged him so much at home that any kind of task or discipline was intolerable. He was a perpetual truant until the day the teacher tried to hit him. He ran out of the room and never came back. His mother excused and supported his wayward behavior, and his foolish father had to give in. I don't think he ever spent more than 2 months in school in his life. Perhaps, I suggested, he preferred to study on his own, with freedom and independence. I've known boys with great curiosity and learning ability who couldn't stand being told what to do, and rejected the teacher and his cane. I've known such boys too, but this wasn't one of them. I don't know where he got his love of knowledge or how he acquired it. The family was completely illiterate. The father was a Scottish peasant who was so ignorant he couldn't even sign his own name. His wife, I believe, could read and sometimes decipher the numbers in an almanac, but that was all. It seems to me that the son's intellect was not much greater. You might as well search for silver platters or marble tables in his home as for a book or a pen. I recall stopping by their house one frigid evening in the winter before last. My father rode with me, as he had business with Sawney Slaught, and we paused for a moment at his gate. While the 2 elderly gentlemen were engaged in conversation, I requested permission to warm myself by the kitchen fire. There, in the corner beside the chimney, seated on a block, I discovered Martin diligently knitting stockings. I thought this an odd pursuit for a young, active man. I expressed my opinion, for I wanted to embarrass him. But he merely smiled at me and replied, without any sign of discomfort, "Just as peculiar a task for a young, active woman. Have you never knitted a stocking?" I told him I had, but also said that if I were of a different gender, or possessed the strength of a man, I would rather work in my field or study a book. To this he replied, "Be glad you are a woman then, and are free to pursue what requires the least effort and the most skill. You see, even though I am a man, I use your privilege and prefer knitting yarn to taxing my brain with a book or the barn floor with a flail." Then I said, "Why you don't put on a petticoat along with handling the needle?" His response was, "Don't wonder. It's because I despise the burden of a petticoat as much as I value warm feet." He proudly showed me the stocking he was knitting, but I didn't touch it, and sarcastically commented that it was excellent work, suggesting he should become a tailor. In response, he looked at me with a simple and naive expression, questioning why I would wonder that he didn't dedicate himself to improving his knitting skills. He asked if I had learned needlework by spending years with a tailor, and he claimed that he could have taught me in just a day. I retorted that I had learned at school, to which he inquired if I had paid for my lessons. I confirmed that I did, but he dismissed it as a waste of money and freedom. He then proposed that if I had a sister, I should send her to him, promising to teach her without punishment or payment. I hesitated, mentioning his aversion to school, but he turned the conversation back to me, expressing surprise at my alleged preference for plowing and studying books over needlework. Just as I was about to leave, he hastily offered me his stockings to wear over my shoes to protect my feet from the snow. I declined the offer, feeling a mix of anger and amusement. Despite my refusal, he had already taken off his stockings and held them in his hand, insisting that I lift my feet so he could quickly slip them on. Seeing that I remained resolute, he dropped the stockings and abruptly lifted me up in his arms. He rushed out of the room, running barefoot through the snow to place me on my horse. It all happened so fast that I didn't have time to comprehend his intentions. He then grabbed my hand, kissed it passionately, and expressed his gratitude for my refusal to accept the stockings. He believed it saved us both the trouble of putting them on and taking them off. Before I could react, he advised me to swap my silk stockings and worsted shoes for leather, assuring me that it would provide warmth and dryness. With a parting blessing, I spurred my horse and eagerly left, relieved to be away from such an eccentric individual. There were numerous instances of equally peculiar behavior that demonstrated a combination of astuteness and foolishness, kindness and impudence. These traits seemed to support the common belief that his mental faculties were unstable. What stood out the most was his immunity to ridicule and criticism. You could insult him for hours, yet he would listen with unwavering composure. It was impossible to provoke anger or shame in him. He would respond, but in a manner that showed he was oblivious to your true meaning. Afterward, he would engage in conversation with the friendly demeanor and freedom of an old friend. Everyone looked down on him for his laziness and foolishness, which were just as evident in his words as in his actions. But no one was afraid of him, and few were angry with him until his affair with Betty was exposed, along with his cruel treatment of his father. "Do you have good reason to believe he was involved with that girl?" I was asked. "Yes, reasons that cannot be discredited. It would not be appropriate for me to state these proofs." He never denied it. On one occasion, when reminded of the inference that any impartial person would draw from the situation, he acknowledged, with his usual calm impudence, that the inference was unavoidable. He even mentioned other concurrent incidents that had escaped the notice of his critics, which further strengthened the conclusion. He was eager to excuse the vices of this woman as long as he was her only lover. But after she married his father, his tone changed. He admitted that she was tidy, capable, and hard-working, but she was still a prostitute. When accused of being instrumental in making her that way, and when his friends pointed out the depravity of blaming her for vices that he was responsible for, he would say, "True, there is depravity and foolishness in the conduct you describe. Go ahead and call me a villain. What of it? I wasn't talking about myself, but about Betty. Nevertheless, this woman is a prostitute. If I was the one who made her that way, I could accuse with even more confidence. But don't think that I blame Betty. If I were in her situation, I would have acted the same way. I would have formed the same notions of my own interests, and pursued them by the same means. Still, I would prefer a different woman to be my father's wife and the mistress of his household." Our conversation was interrupted by a messenger from my wife, who asked me to return home immediately. Several days had passed since Slaught's departure, and I had been hoping to meet with him soon. However, it was Wortley who urgently called for my attention. He shared his suspicions and concerns regarding Welbeck and Slaught, which had been reignited by a recent incident. He requested a patient audience to explain his findings. Wortley began by recounting an encounter he had that day. A person had presented him with a letter from a merchant friend in Baltimore. It was evident that the bearer was a sea captain with a sensible and pleasing demeanor. The letter recommended the captain, named Williams, to Wortley's friendship and counsel. The letter revealed a disturbing story. A mariner named Amos Watson, residing in Baltimore, had mysteriously disappeared in the summer of the previous year. Watson had arrived in the city from Jamaica, intending to immediately reunite with his family in Baltimore. However, he never reached his destination, and no trace of him had been found since. Williams, the bearer of the letter, had come to investigate the secret behind Watson's fate. Wortley was earnestly entreated to provide assistance and advice in the search. Willing to help, Wortley offered Williams hospitality at his house, which was gratefully accepted. Williams proceeded to reveal the details of the case. According to Williams, on the 20th of June the previous year, he and Captain Watson had arrived together from the West Indies. Williams captained the ship on which Watson traveled as a passenger, as Watson's own ship had been seized by the English. They had a strong friendship, further strengthened by Watson's marriage to Williams's sister. Upon their arrival, they went to dine with Mr. Keisler, who lived in Water Street, but had since passed away. Watson was eager to visit his family and had a few errands to run in the city, which would only take a couple of hours. He planned to depart the following morning in a stagecoach. Meanwhile, Williams had urgent engagements that required him to travel swiftly to New York, although he was also keen to reach Baltimore, where his own friends resided. He expected to return in 3 days and then follow Watson home. When Williams returned within the agreed time frame, he called at Keisler's place. Keisler was an old acquaintance of both Watson and Williams. During their conversation, Keisler expressed surprise at Watson's sudden departure from his house. Williams explained the necessity for Watson's immediate journey southward, assuming that his brother had provided an explanation. However, Keisler informed Williams that although Watson had mentioned his intention to leave town the following day, he had led Keisler to believe that he would stay and lodge at his house that night. Yet Watson had not shown up, and his trunk remained at Keisler's place. Keisler found it unlikely that Watson would have forgotten his luggage in the rush of departure. This led Keisler to suspect that Watson was still in town, leaving him puzzled for the past 3 days as to Watson's whereabouts. Surprisingly, when Keisler inquired among the few friends Watson had in the city, they were equally ignorant of his movements. Williams had been worried that Watson may have gotten into some accident or other. He went to Watson's friends to inquire of his whereabouts, but none of them had seen him since he arrived. Williams then tried to remember the tasks Watson intended to fulfill, hoping to trace him based on his last known appearance. Among the tasks was the delivery of several packets, one of which was addressed to Walter Thetford. After some investigation, Williams discovered that Thetford was out of town at that time. However, he learned from a clerk handling Thetford's business that someone matching Watson's description had visited on the day Williams saw him last. The visitor had left papers regarding the English capture of one of Thetford's vessels. That was all the information Williams was able to gather. Next, he went to the 3 merchants for whom Watson carried letters. They acknowledged receiving the letters, but they were delivered through the postal service. He had to immediately return home due to other commitments, and after doing everything he could to find Watson, he decided that the man had most likely left for home as planned, but had left his trunk inadvertently. Williams also checked the stagecoach office's records, but Watson's name was not registered, and there had been no water transport during the past week. Finally, Williams decided that Watson had most likely set off for home. Upon arriving in Baltimore, however, he found out that Watson had not arrived. The mystery surrounding Watson's disappearance deepened, and Williams's concerns grew stronger. Watson's wife presented a letter with a postmark from Philadelphia, indicating that it had been sent to the post office the morning after their arrival. The letter had been written by Watson in Williams's presence, but the latter had advised against sending it since Watson intended to travel on the same coach. Williams distinctly remembered his friend placing the unsealed letter in his pocketbook. However, to his surprise, the very same letter, unchanged and still containing the money meant to be enclosed, had somehow ended up in the hands of Watson's wife. In the letter, he mentioned his plan to depart for Baltimore on the 21st, yet the letter had already been deposited at the post office on that very day. They had hoped that the mystery surrounding Watson's disappearance would be quickly resolved and that he would return home soon. However, since that day, no information has been received about his whereabouts. The subsequent outbreak of yellow fever in the city, combined with Williams's obligations, had delayed his arrival and hindered him from resuming the search. According to Williams, Watson was a remarkable man who was deeply loved by his wife. Her distress and anguish over his absence were understandable, as she and their children relied on him for their livelihood. However, Williams himself had additional reasons for wanting to discover his friend's fate. He had entrusted Watson with several bills of exchange on Baltimore merchants, received as payment for his cargo, expecting them to be promptly presented and accepted. Unfortunately, both the bills and the bearer had vanished. There was also another matter of significance tied to Watson's existence. An English family, previously residing in Jamaica and owning a valuable estate, had been living near Baltimore for several years. Their history and circumstances were intertwined with Watson's, making it important to uncover his fate in relation to them. A year ago, the patriarch of the family passed away, leaving behind a widow and 3 daughters. The lady decided to sell her late husband's property in Jamaica, as the island was increasingly at risk of war and revolution, and moved to the United States, where she planned to reside from then on. Watson, a friend of her late husband, was entrusted with the legal power to sell the estate due to his reputation for honesty and selflessness. He carried out his commission dutifully, receiving the purchase price promptly. To ensure the utmost security for the funds, Watson rolled up 4 bills of exchange, drawn on wealthy London merchants, in a sheet of lead. He then placed this roll in a leather belt, which he fastened around his waist and concealed under his clothing. A second set of bills was given to another person, while a third set was sent to Mr. Kiesler via a ship that sailed a few days before Watson. Upon arriving in the city, they discovered that Kiesler had received the bills sent to him and had been instructed to keep them until their arrival. Upon meeting, the bills were produced and delivered to Watson, who combined them with the ones he was carrying in his belt. He believed this method of conveyance to be the safest, and saw no need to resort to other methods for the remaining journey. The sum he carried was a staggering £10,000 sterling, which constituted the entire inheritance of a worthy and excellent family. Sadly, the loss of this money has left them destitute. Watson has disappeared, and no one knows where he has gone. The family and friends are beside themselves with worry, and cannot fathom the potential disasters that may befall them due to Watson's fate. It is almost unbelievable that Watson is still alive. How could he be in a situation where he couldn't communicate with his family? The grief of his loved ones has been made worse by the suspicions of Mrs. Morris and her friends. They insinuate that Watson, tempted by a huge prize, has secretly left Jamaica for England to get payment for some bills and keep the money for himself. Watson was never one to tolerate poverty, but his honesty was never in question. He grumbled at his destiny, having to risk his life at sea to make a living, and all the property he worked for was taken by the English. But if he had given in to temptation, it would have been when he received those bills in Jamaica. It would have been much easier to go straight to London instead of making his way to England through other means. Those who truly knew him would never suspect him of being dishonest. If he is dead and the bills can't be recovered, at least his name can be cleared. As long as his fate is unknown, his reputation will be smeared with the worst accusations. If the bills are paid in London, those accusations will seem justified. If he was robbed, the thief would hurry to get the payment, and the Morrises might reasonably assume that Watson was the thief. Williams added many other details to show how much trouble Watson's death and the loss of his papers have caused. "I was at a loss," Wortley said, "on how to advise this man. Kiesler, who was the only resident in this city that Williams knew, had died early from the plague. When I suggested preventing the sale of the bills in America, Williams informed me that this had already been done through a public notice. I recalled seeing the advertisement in which the bills were reported lost or stolen in this city, with a reward of $1,000 offered for their return. The notice had been published in September in all the trading towns from Portsmouth to Savannah, but it had produced no results. Williams and I went to the mayor's office hoping to find some record of Watson's whereabouts in the last 6 months, but neither the records nor the mayor's memory provided any help. Watson's friends had also published a description of his person, dress, and the papers he had in his possession, along with how they had been secured. This had been printed in the southern newspapers and recently reprinted in our own. However, as the first notice had been unsuccessful, they felt it necessary to try again with this second attempt. After some reflection, I thought it might be useful to renew Williams's efforts to trace Watson's movements up until his disappearance. Williams had followed Watson to Thetford's, but Thetford himself had not been seen, and Williams had only received vague information from his clerk. Unfortunately, Thetford and his family, including his clerk, had perished, and it seemed as though this source of information had dried up. I decided to pay a visit to old Thetford in hopes that he might shed some light on his nephew's dealings and help me unravel this mystery. However, my efforts were in vain, as he was unable to provide me with the answers I sought. As we conversed, I mentioned the packet that Watson had delivered to him, containing important documents related to the capture of a certain ship. This seemed to trigger memories of the harm that Welbeck had caused him, and Thetford went on a tirade against the man. Eventually he revealed to me the connection between his past grievances and the ship in question. Welbeck, it turned out, was the owner of the vessel and its cargo. He had sent it to a profitable market and made sure to secure an adequate insurance policy. To ensure the validity of the policy and assess the true value of the ship and cargo, Welbeck had enlisted the help of his two nephews, one of whom had served as the supercargo on the voyage. This was what motivated Thetford to lend Welbeck 3 notes in exchange for 3 other notes, with the total amount including an equitable interest of 5% per month on his own loan. Thetford was no fool, however, and did not rely on Welbeck's supposed wealth and secret funds to pay off the debt. Instead, he had arranged for his nephew, the supercargo, to intercept a portion of the voyage's profits and use it to pay off the debt. In case of any losses, Thetford had also secured a similar security on the insurance policy. Jameson had followed the same plan as his own, and there seemed to be no danger in their scheme. However, their calculations proved to be wrong. The ship was captured and condemned due to a reason that made the insurance useless. I didn't spend much time thinking about the fraud and extortion that had occurred, or the chain of events that often ruins the plans of the crafty. The names Welbeck and Watson were intertwined in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling of unease and suspicion. Welbeck was capable of anything. It was possible that he had met with Watson, and that the runaway had played a part in Watson's fate. I shared my thoughts with Williams, who became incredibly agitated at the mention of Welbeck's name. Williams expressed his familiarity with the history of Welbeck, as his friend had often recounted it to him. There had been a close connection between them, and Watson had bestowed numerous acts of kindness upon Welbeck, believing him to be honest. However, Welbeck's response to these acts of benevolence had been a display of the darkest treachery. Watson's grief over the calamities caused by Welbeck and his desire for revenge had driven him to temporary madness, abandoning his usual composed and patient demeanor. Williams had often inquired about Watson's intentions if he were to meet Welbeck again, to which his brother admitted that he would likely act irrationally, defying his own principles and familial obligations. Williams revealed that Watson had no intention of resorting to stabbing or shooting Welbeck, as he did not possess the nature of an assassin. Watson confessed that his plan, in the heat of the moment, would involve vehemently reprimanding Welbeck with impassioned words and then challenging him to a duel, a confrontation where one of them would not leave alive. He acknowledged the need to give Welbeck time to reconcile with his conscience, and for him to tarnish Welbeck's reputation and make arrangements in the event of his potential demise. Williams firmly believed that it was highly likely that Welbeck and Watson had indeed crossed paths. Thetford would undoubtedly have mentioned Welbeck's name and involvement in the seized ship, thereby revealing his presence in the city. Considering the gravity of their encounter, Williams feared that Watson's disappearance of his brother could be attributed to that fateful meeting. Chapter 19. As I delved deeper into the character of Welbeck, new revelations came to light, fueling my suspicions. Williams's conclusions were undeniably plausible, but how could we confirm them? Perhaps Walter Thetford or someone in his family had witnessed something that, when combined with our existing knowledge, could strengthen or extend our lead. Unfortunately, Thetford's father-in-law was the only member of his family who had managed to escape the plague by fleeing the city. Without hesitation, Williams went to see the old man. The old man's recollections of that fateful period were jogged by various circumstances, and he eventually revealed that he had been present during a meeting between Watson and Walter Thetford. During the meeting, Watson had delivered some packages that were related to the condemnation of a ship, in which Thomas Thetford had been a supercargo. The old man had noticed that the stranger had been visibly affected when Welbeck's involvement in the vessel was mentioned by his son Walter. The old man recounted his recollections of the events involving his son Walter and his companion. He vividly remembered how the stranger had expressed his intention to visit Welbeck and had asked Waffelter for directions to his house. The next morning, during breakfast, the old man brought up the incidents of the previous day and inquired how Welbeck had reacted to the news of his ship's loss. Walter replied, saying that Welbeck had taken it in stride, as a man of his wealth should, but his behavior had been peculiar. Walter shared how Welbeck had reacted with a brief moment of fear and confusion upon hearing the name of the captain who had brought the papers and mentioned his intention to visit. In a sudden frenzy, Welbeck grabbed his hat and rushed out of the house. It was later revealed that Welbeck had absconded from his creditors on that very night. I have just come back from a meeting with old Thetford. I came to you because I thought it possible that Slaught had returned, as you expected, and I wanted to see the boy once more. My suspicions about him have been confirmed, and a warrant was issued today for his arrest as Welbeck's accomplice, Wortley said, finally informing me of the purpose of his visit. He continued, "The suspicions to which he is exposed will not easily be dispelled, but if he has anything to say in his defense, his judicial examination will afford him the suitable opportunity. Why are you so much afraid to subject his innocence to this test? It was not until you heard his tale that your own suspicions were removed. Allow me the same privilege of unbelief. But you are mistaken in thinking I am responsible for his arrest. Jameson and Thetford are the ones who brought him in, and they did not act on mere assumptions or revenge. They have uncovered facts that you are unaware of, and once you know them, even your skepticism about Slaught's guilt will be overcome," Wortley said. "Tell me these facts, please. If Slaught has deceived me, then I will lose faith in humanity. All distinctions between right and wrong will be erased, and no one's word or evidence will hold any weight with me," I pleaded. "It's about time that you stopped trusting smooth faces and persuasive words. Until I entered my current profession and gained first-hand knowledge of the world, I was equally naive. I only learned the truth through experience, and I suppose your belief will only be shattered through your own experience."